India's permanent representative to the UN Ambassador T.S. Tirumurthy on Monday speaking in the UN General Assembly on the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council said that nothing has moved for more than a decade in the intergovernmental negotiations except hearing passionate statements on the need for reform. Criticizing the absence of even a single negotiating text, Tirumurthy said that the IGN has become like a platform for debate in a university rather than a serious result-oriented process in the United Nations consisting of sovereign member states. Meanwhile, addressing a virtual summit of the BRICS grouping, Prime Minister Narendra Modi reiterated India's long-standing demand of reformed multilateralism, calling the theme global stability, shared security and innovative growth not only relevant but also far-sighted. Prime Minister Modi said questions are being raised on the credibility of global institutions. He emphasized on reform of institutions like the UN, IMF, WTO and WHO to gain credibility. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze reforms in the UNSC and other impaired blocs. Joining me on the program today are Gurjeet Singh, former ambassador, KP Nair, strategic analyst, and Pramit Pal Chowdhury, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. This issue of reforms as far as multilateral organizations are concerned is not a new one. It's been going on for several years now. India keeps raising these issues over and over again. Are they falling on deaf ears?
Well, they are certainly falling on disinterested ears, for sure. And the way that we are hammering away at reform now, and the projects that are coming up, and the Prime Minister has mentioned these in, his speech to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, into the BRICS, and in the UN itself on the 75th anniversary. What we arrive at is this, that while we are talking of reform, actually we are looking at a kind of restructuring of the international order, which must be more equitable. And India has always stood for this since the war and allowed Africa and other newly emerging countries to be a participant. Now, when you hear Permanent Representative Tirumurthy lamenting the lack of action on the intergovernmental negotiations, he even says that no records are kept. Every time you have a meeting, you start all over again. So certainly the whole process needs reform, whereas the structure needs restructuring. Now, there are three things that he mentioned. One is about, the General Assembly, rules of procedure need to alter. We need to alter the methods of working. And most of all, we need to alter the membership of the UN Security Council, including at the permanent level. Now, this is where he says that the UN system has stopped working. And in the pandemic, this has become most visible. So today, if you look at the major threats, globalization, terrorism, pandemic, and climate change, you find that the UN system is not resilient, is not responsive, and is trying to give you solutions through an old structure which has lost its elasticity. Therefore, you really need to hammer them into a new position. A lot of countries say this can't be done, but you remember the G7, one big crisis in 2008, and the G7 converted itself to the G20. But that is because the G7 was not a structured institution like the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions. So therefore, I think we need to look at these institutions in the context of new challenges and see how best we can bring them into tandem with popular expectation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mr. Nair, let me bring you to the picture now. So, why is it that, reforms are so far and difficult to come by as far as these organizations are concerned?
Well, in the United Nations, forget reforms. Even adopting a document is a very laborious process, you see. to change a comma, you have to have so many discussions, and then everything. I don't know how they translate commas, but every document has to be translated into 6 languages, and and then there will be discussions about the accuracy of these each of these languages. So getting anything done in the UN is a very laborious process. But in the context of what Ambassador Tirumurthy said in his speech, we have a problem in the General Assembly this year. You see, since Vijayalakshmi Pandit was elected president of the General Assembly in 1953, we have always had presidents of the General Assembly, normally known as PGA, who have been friendly to us. Everybody, virtually every PGA has been friendly to us. For the first time that I can remember, we have a president of the General Assembly who is not friendly to us. He's a Turkish diplomat. And he, for purposes of today's discussion in the context of reforming the Security Council, he has been associated with the Coffee Club, of which Pakistan is a leading light. So, his predecessor was from Latin America. Before that, we had the Slovak presidency. Before that, we had the Afghan presidency. So all these people were by and large in favor of doing something to take forward the Security Council reform. But till next September, as long as the Turkish presidency continues, I can be fairly certain that by we, I mean the group of 4, India, Germany, Japan, Brazil, which want speedy reform, will face a lot of roadblocks in the General Assembly. But I think we are getting prepared. For one thing, the fact that we will be in the Security Council from January 1st gives us that extra clout. We can leverage the Security Council membership to a very large extent in getting things done in the General Assembly. And Tirumurthy, from what I can see, has been very active, for instance, we revived and did a lot of work relating to least developed countries in the last few months, small island nations in the last few months. We have just got into a committee. Through the 4th committee, we have got into an Arab group relating to UNRWA, the UN Organization for the Relief of Palestinians. So we are getting involved in the General Assembly from various sides, sort of reviving our old contacts in the non-aligned movement through various other ways. So we are making an effort, but as I said, the reform this year and next year, till September, is not going to be easy. There will be a lot of challenges, but we have to grit our teeth and make an effort to move it forward as far as possible.
All right. So in such a scenario then, Pramitpal Chaudhary, what should India's options be really going forward? Because this is something of utmost importance as far as we are concerned.
Well, UN Security Council reform, while it's of course greatly important to us, we have to recognize that this is a relatively long-term program. However, we were able to get through a draft text through the General Assembly last time. An opening sort of opened up, we were able to get that through. Now, as Ambassador Tirumurthy has pointed out, there's now an attempt to develop, or there is a present agreement to try and use, should we say, negotiating tactics to block us from moving that forward. So as he correctly said, in the intergovernmental negotiations, nobody's even allowed to vote. As Ambassador Gurjit Singh mentioned, there are no notes taken. These are procedural issues designed to ensure that that draft text does not move forward. So the first step we need to do, which the ambassador laid out in his speech to the UN, is try to break that procedural jam, so that at least a draft text can begin to move forward. The second element is more difficult, which is to see how we can get the permanent members in the Security Council, the 5 ones who hold veto power, because any single one of them can effectively veto any further, any move to the reforms if it goes forward beyond the General Assembly. That will be more difficult because at present, the original, should we say, opportunity that arose because all 4 out of the 5 members supported India's entry. The Americans and the Europeans were coming to a sense that they'd had too many seats, that UK, France, and perhaps a combined EU seat or a single European seat would make sense. And so it was only China that remained opposed, and at least privately the Chinese said, though it wasn't probably completely true, that they were prepared to allow us in, but they were not prepared to allow Japan in, for example. If we were not part of the G4, they might reconsider. Now, at the present state of the UNSC 5 members, we have, at least under the Trump administration, a government that is a US that is hostile to any change, or actually just disinterested in the UN altogether. China remains, if anything, even more adamantly now opposed to an Indian change. Even Russia is not enthusiastic about changing. It's not opposed to us, but it doesn't want to water down or dilute its position. And with Britain leaving the European Union, Britain does not want to give up its seat either, so there is no question of a single European seat anymore. So in many ways, the present window at the Security Council level doesn't exist. So it's going to take a while. But there's no reason why you shouldn't prepare the ground otherwise for potential reform at some later point. It's hard to predict sometimes when these windows open diplomatically for us to move forward.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, but other than that, we do have other issues in the UN which fall short of UNSC reform, but ones which we are concerned about. One, we need to reform, it's very clear, reform a number of UN agencies. The World Health Organization did not cover itself in glory during this pandemic. The World Trade Organization is limping, and it needs to be changed in some ways. We are increasingly concerned about the number of UN agencies which have been systematically taken over by the Chinese. If I'm correct, a Chinese person now heads 5 UN agencies, which is a record for any country, and is actually unprecedented. And you can see the Chinese now pushing agendas in the UN that are specifically designed to promote themselves. For example, at a time when we are banning or moving to stop Huawei 5G technology, they are trying to get UN agencies like the International Telecommunications Union to endorse Huawei 5G equipment as a UN standard. So that's another area, that's an immediate area that we need to be working on.
Absolutely. All right. So taking the discussion forward then, so it's not just limited to the UNSC, like you mentioned in your opening remarks, Ambassador. These multilateral organizations need to be abreast with the times, and they need to be, up to date. So, it's not just limited to the UNSC, but even others like, the WTO, WHO, IMF, and other wings and other bodies and other blocks too need to be, we need to see reforms there too.
Most certainly. And I would say, for instance, the IMF reform, being rather technical, is not openly discussed. But I think that is very important because the way IMF deals in a prescriptive way with developing countries is rather sad. So I think when India has the G20 leadership, we should look at IMF reform because the G20 have a pretty strong say as a number of countries in what the IMF does. And I think we should not be apprehensive of what the Chinese will not do, but try and reform the IMF for the betterment of the world around us. Secondly, there is undoubtedly, as I said, pandemic big issue. Therefore, WHO needs to be empowered to become much more responsive to the requirements in dealing with pandemics. This, I think, structurally, it is not organized to do so. Third, the WTO. We are now looking to elect a new Director General where the will of the majority is being thwarted by one country. So this kind of thing goes on, this bargain hunting. But the point in the bargain hunting is sometimes you end up with very cheap alternatives. So this is something we need to avoid. So how to improve the functioning of WTO, particularly the dispute settlement mechanism, which is vital for developing countries, is something we need to keep working on. Coming back to what both Mr. Nair and Mr. Pal Chaudhary have very succinctly explained about UN Security Council, and very realistically, I would say. So one of the realistic points about this is, this mantra that we have got, that we support the common African position. And when you support the common African position, which is unclear on who are its nominees for the Security Council, which insists that it will decide, not the General Assembly, but the African Union will decide who the nominees are, is not something which is conducive to the settlement of this issue. And most people, therefore, use the mouthing of this mantra to keep saying, say, how confused this is. Secondly, most African countries left to themselves would simply like an expansion in the non-permanent space. So that is where they have better chances of getting in. Not the permanent. They have no real interest in permanent because they don't know who's going to be the permanent member. Whereas the G4 thinks we have a birthright. But please remember, what we are looking for is a, amendment to the charter. And if that amendment ever comes, we will all have to go to the General Assembly to fight elections to fill the new seats. So I think, as Mr. Chaudhary said, that this is not something going to happen soon. But the way I've noticed Indian leaders speaking now, it seems we have acquired greater vehemence in our international utterances, or say, see, this is going nowhere. The second point is that, France, I think, is now a very good friend of India. It is for us today what Russia was in earlier years in the Security Council, our Suraksha Kavach. Now, and as Mr. Paramit Paul Chaudhary said, Britain is quite unsure with Brexit how much more exit it has to do. So what you are left with really is China, backed by Russia, and the United States. Now, both of them don't want to change the Security Council to a large extent. In fact, if you ask me, the Chinese today are the arch conservatives on UN reform. They don't want anything to reform because they have gamed the system. And as he said, they are holding 5 presidencies of different organizations. Here, I bring you to the question. Have we focused too much of our diplomatic energy on UN Security Council reform and not focused on other agencies? Why is it that we have late candidatures and weak candidatures? Why don't we have a plan to take over some agencies either through election or through nomination by the Secretary General? We seem to be missing out here on both counts. So I think we need to look at restructuring in a little broader way.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point that you've raised there. I want to take that particular point forward with Mr. Nair. Mr. Nair, as far as some of these agencies are concerned, should we start focusing on some of these smaller agencies, and should we not invest heavily in the UNSC, at least for the time being, because we know it's a long drawn out process and that's something that we can keep chipping at, over the years. And should we focus on other agencies where we can have an immediate impact?
That is necessary, as Ambassador Gurjit Singh said, and implicit in your question. But in a way, I would say that at least to a limited extent, we have started doing that. For example, the Prime Minister this year unusually spoke at the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council meeting. That, as far as I recall, this is the first time that in recent times a Prime Minister has addressed an ECOSOC meeting. And of course, we cannot ignore the fact that a Pakistani has just been elected, Munir Akram, as president of ECOSOC. But I don't think that was the main consideration in the Prime Minister addressing ECOSOC. We cannot let go of these organizations. We have a lineage, we have a tradition. ECOSOC, for example, from 1946, the 3 sessions of ECOSOC. An Indian headed it, the famous civil servant Ramaswamy Mudaliar, you see. Then, as I mentioned earlier, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit at the UN General Assembly, but of course we cannot go back to that position. So I would say that we have started doing this in a small way, but our steps have to be very gingerly. Earlier, there was a reference to Bretton Woods Organization, World Bank and IMF and all. You see, we have to do it very carefully. For example, World Bank and IMF reform, you see. If we try to reform these financial organizations, we may come up with something to our disadvantage. For instance, we get loans from the soft loan windows of these organizations. Some years back, the developed countries, Britain in particular, as far as I recall, said that India should no longer be given soft loans, loans from the soft loan window, because India has developed. These are meant for countries that are not so developed. India has moved forward. India is an emerging economy. It's in the G20, so we must stop these soft window loans for India. So should we give up these benefits in an altruistic effort to reform these organizations? So should we look at the benefits we are getting, or should we look at, in an unselfish way, look at the broader interest? So we have to very carefully plan ahead, you see. That Absolutely. Applies to the takeover of smaller organizations also. But I think that we are indeed going ahead in a small way. And I would like to make a small reference to what Ambassador Gurjit Singh said about Africa. As far as I recall, he has lived in Africa and he has handled Africa before in our headquarters. I thought it was very significant that the Prime Minister yesterday at the BRICS meeting mentioned Security Council reform, because the South African president was there. And it was necessary to underscore this point about Security Council reform in the presence of the South Africans, because, as Ambassador Gurjit Singh said, that the Africans are a problem. Otherwise, long ago, G4 would have become G5, including the Africans. So that is something we need to pay attention to.
Right, sure. All right. And so what's the best way forward then? Pravit Pal Chaudhary, close the show for us with your concluding remarks on the best way forward.
Well, I think while we maintain, as I said, we have to move forward on trying to break the procedural jams that have been put in place at the General Assembly. That has to be the next step to move the draft forward. In the ultimate goal, whether we should recognize it's going to take a while for UN Security Council reform, we will need to still continue to talk to the permanent 5 members as to what their positions are and persuade them to reconsider at least some of their foot dragging on this issue. And the Biden administration will be a particularly important player for us over the next 4 years. But I think in the short term, we need to be looking at the growing influence of China in the United Nations. And as others have mentioned, we need to start putting forward either our own candidates or working out strategies to ensure that candidates who are friendlier to us are put in place. And this means coalition building in the UN in smaller organizations, which we sometimes, I think, don't pay attention to. And then we are prepared now to we have to work with countries like the US and others to reform specific UN agencies, which are continuing to have difficulties. And I'll just add a fourth element is UN peacekeeping. We have always been a huge provider. We are the world's largest provider historically of troops to the UN peacekeeping. China has now become the world's largest contributor of funding to the peacekeeping department, partly because the US has pulled out. We need to get in more countries to provide funding. And we're now starting to see China increasingly send troops. They're not very good at it yet, but they're starting to send troops on peacekeeping missions. And we need to keep a very close eye because the peacekeeping missions of China are not about peacekeeping. They are about increasing Chinese influence.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that we need to see a restructuring of the world order to allow developing countries and middle powers a seat at the high table so that they too can ensure that their voices are heard. Globalization, terror, COVID-19 and climate change are four of the biggest issues facing the world today. But multilateral blocs such as the UN and others are finding it difficult to address them because they have an age-old approach. These blocs or agencies need to change and be abreast with the times so that they can address some of these major challenges that the world is facing. As far as the UN reforms are concerned, let's not forget the UNGA presidency is with Turkey at this point in time, and Turkey is seen to be close to Pakistan and does not want to see any kind of reforms in the UN, as this will be in India.